Okay, so this is our deep dive on epithelial tissue. First off, what are the functions of epithelial tissue? In our last video, we talked about how epithelial tissue is primarily a lining. It almost always faces a opening, whether that opening is the outside world, outside of your body, like your skin faces, whether that opening is the inside of your intestinal tract, which is technically outside your body, or whether it's an internal body cavity, such as your thoracic cavity, your cranial cavity, or even the insides of your blood vessels. The first function of epithelial tissue is to act as a barrier. It is generally what separates one thing from another. Epithelial tissue almost always sits on what's called the basement membrane. Now, this isn't a membrane like the plasma membrane or the cell membrane. This is a different type of membrane we'll delve further into later, but basically another usage of the word membrane is a thin layer of tissue. And so the epithelial tissue almost always sits on top of connective tissue, at least a little bit of connective tissue. And the basement membrane is a thin layer of connective tissue, a thin layer of extracellular matrix that connects what's called the basal surface of the epithelium to the connective tissue. It's basically what binds the epithelial tissue to the connective tissue. Since epithelial tissue always faces a open area on one side and a connective tissue area on the other, we have a directionality to it. The surface that faces the open area is called the apical surface. The surface that faces the connective tissue is called the basal surface. It sits on top of the basal lamina or the basement membrane. The side surfaces usually border other epithelial cells, and those are called the lateral surfaces. The basement membrane is composed of two layers, the basal lamina and the reticular lamina, with the basal lamina connecting to the basal surface of the epithelium, and the reticular lamina connecting into and basically becoming a part of the connective tissue. So epithelium usually forms a barrier and therefore protects deeper tissue. Epithelial tissue is very easy to regenerate, so if it dies, your body can make more of it relatively simply. So it's there kind of like to be the first layer of defense. You got to get through it to get to anything deeper that might be harder to regenerate. Epithelium is, since it is lining everything, for the most part, whenever your body excretes something, secretes it, or whenever your body absorbs something, it does so through the epithelium. So, for instance, the epithelium in your intestinal tract are going to secrete digestive enzymes and absorb nutrients. The epithelium in your skin is going to secrete oil and sweat and things like that. The epithelium lining your mucous membranes in your respiratory and digestive tracts are going to secrete mucus, among a few other things as well. So they produce and release chemical secretions, sweat, mucus, stomach acid in your stomach, things like that. Also hormones. They can excrete wastes. the lining of your the lining of the tubes in your kidney called nephrons, which are exchange surfaces where waste products are expelled from. Those are made of epithelial cells. They absorb chemicals, including nutrients and vitamins and other things like that, as well as oxygen in your lungs. Your epithelial tissue can filter substances, particularly in the kidneys and liver. You have these interfaces between your blood and other things that can filter out your blood, allowing good stuff to pass through and bad stuff to be trapped, or the other way around. And your epithelium contains most of your sensory surfaces. You have a lot of sensory nerve endings in your epithelium, particularly in your skin, but other epithelial surfaces as well. Those nerve endings don't actually go into the epithelium, but they go into the basement membrane that the epithelium rests on top of, and they can sense disturbances in your epithelium, which is how you sense hot, cold, and light touch and things like that. Other functions. No, I basically just talked about that. So, one of the things we said was a distinguishing characteristic of epithelial tissue is that you have cells located next to other cells. This is something that you don't tend to see in connective tissue. In connective tissue, you usually have cells sitting inside this large network of cables called the extracellular matrix. But epithelial tissue, and to a lesser extent muscular and nervous tissue, have cells running right next to each other. And those cells aren't just sort of sitting there next to each other. They're actually connected to each other. And they're connected to each other by special things called cell junctions, of which there are several types. And it's actually pretty important that you know what these types are, because they each have different functions, and they're going to be pretty important later on. The types of cell junctions that exist are tight junctions, Adherens junctions, desmosomes, hemidesmosomes, and gap junctions. First is tight junctions. You can think of tight junctions as being like a seam weld. All right. Usually with tight junctions, you have proteins that pierce the membranes of both of the cells that are next to each other, and they occur in dense lines, going all the way from side to side, usually multiple layers of dense lines. And they bind cells very tightly together, hence the name tight junctions. And they make a waterproof seal, right? So things can't get through here. Things will try to get in between the cells and they'll bounce away. And even things that are as small as water will have a very difficult time getting in between these cells. So, and however, there's no exchange of materials between the two neighboring cells. They're just welded together. They don't get to actually share anything among themselves. So you're going to find this in any portion of the body that needs to be watertight. For example, the digestive system and the bladder. right? So you don't want your digestive system leaking anything. You don't want anything from your digestive system being able to get into the surrounding fluids, because you have things like stomach acid. It'd be really suck if your stomach leaked stomach acid into the surrounding tissue. You didn't end up with horrible ulcers, digesting yourself, or digestive enzymes leaking into your surrounding tissues. All of that would be bad. Similarly, if your bladder was not watertight, you would be having a very bad day. The second type of cell junction is what's called an Adherens junction. Adherens junctions, like tight junctions, run in a band. So they're also kind of a seam weld, but seam welds are sort of more tight. They don't let anything through. Adherens junctions aren't as tight. You've got these proteins that kind of interlock with each other and hold the cells together. So I think of them as being a little bit more like a zipper. You've got all of these teeth that are hooking into each other, and it creates a really long contact surface that holds things together pretty well. But it's not watertight. Big things like proteins and cells have a very difficult time getting through here, but small things like water and hormones and small chemicals can probably move through pretty easily. The proteins that form the teeth of this zipper are special proteins called cadherins. And remember that, because I'm going to ask you at some point about what proteins make up these things. So in tight junctions, we had one protein that would be like a thing that went all the way across, like a staple or a rivet or something, and connected the cells together like that. Here we have something that's much more of a, it just sticks out, and then you have teeth that kind of catch against each other, but they could theoretically be pulled apart. These are sort of inherently stretchy. They allow one cell to tug against each other and to stretch and deform without ripping each other apart. Tight junctions, if the cells were to stretch, or if one cell was to stretch or contract, it would probably rip the neighboring cell to pieces when it did so. But these have some give in them. And so you are particularly likely to find them in cells that are supposed to contract or stretch. So, in particular, in, say, muscle cells and other contractile cells. Our third cell junction type is a desmosome. Now, desmosomes, instead of being a line or a seam, are sort of a spot weld, except they're not perfectly tight. So you can think of them more as being like a snap or a button. So you just have this one area where you have a snap with the cell next to it. And again, this snap is made out of these proteins here that go in between the cells and that lock kind of teeth with each other. And these are cadherin. Again. So it uses the same type of interlocking tooth protein as we saw in the Adherens junction. These desmosomes, these places where two cells are snapped together, serve as attachment points for the cytoskeleton. If you recall back in the cell lecture, we said that there are three cytoskeletal components: microfilaments, intermediate filaments, and microtubules. And intermediate filaments were like the ones that are like ropes. They resist pulling forces a lot. And intermediate filaments will typically hook on to this adherens, or to this desmosome, and they'll pull against each other, because here's an area where you can get like a good anchor point. Hemidesmosomes. Now, hemi means like half or part, and that is in fact what these are. So a desmosome is a spot weld or a snap that snaps two cells together. Here, we don't have a snap that's going to snap two cells together. Remember how epithelial cells, or at least epithelial tissue, always attaches to the basement membrane on its basal side, on its downside? Well, it's not just sitting there. It's actually physically attached. So this is not actually a cell-cell attachment. This is what's going to attach the cell to the extracellular matrix. And so here we see the hemidesmosome, and you'll see that it's actually attaching to the basement membrane rather than to another cell. The other difference here is that the protein that is actually the snap-together protein is different. And that's because the sort of tooth-in-tooth model that, like, the zipper Adherens Junction and the snap desmosome used wouldn't work here. Because there's no other teeth for it to latch onto. This basement membrane doesn't have the other protein that's going to hook into it. So instead, we have these special proteins called integrin. And integrins are proteins that grab hold of these extracellular matrix cable proteins, particularly that grab hold of collagen, which is the main protein in the extracellular matrix. And so we have the hemidesmosome with these integrin sections, and then this integrin is like grabbing hold of this cable that's running out in the basement membrane. Last, we have gap junctions. Now, so far, all of the ones that we've talked about have just been attachment points. They might have been tight attachment points that were waterproof. They might have been loose attachment points like adherens and desmosomes that allow water to move in between the cells and other things to move in between the cells. But none of them have allowed for any sort of transfer between the two cells that were connected. This is where gap junctions are different. The primary function of gap junctions isn't actually to hold the cells together. They do that, but they don't actually do that as well as a desmosome or an adherens junction would. The primary function of gap junctions is to allow an exchange of materials. So you could have little molecules in one cell, and they will flow through the gap junction to the other side, flow through there, flow through here as well. So these are small openings. They're too small to allow things like proteins or organelles or anything like that to pass through. But small molecules like ions or hormones or signaling molecules and sometimes nutrients can pass through. This is particularly important in nerve and muscle tissue. When a nerve or muscle tissue, primarily muscle in this case, is being excited, it has ions that are flowing inside of it. If one muscle cell needs to pass its signal on to the next muscle cell, right, then those ions can move into one cell and then through the gap junction into the next cell, where they just start kicking off the reaction. And it makes for a much faster transmission. These are particularly found in smooth muscle cells and in cardiac muscle cells, where you have cells that need to communicate with each other in a coordinated fashion. Like you want to have all of your heart basically beating in unison. These cells, the proteins that form the junction point in gap junctions are special tube-shaped proteins called connexons. And these connexon protein complexes are formed of the connexin protein. And their primary purpose is communication rather than attachment, though they do serve that attachment function as well. You will often see gap junctions in the presence of desmosomes, where the desmosome's job is to actually hook the two surfaces together and provide strength, whereas the gap junction allows for communication and information flow. Epithelial tissue there are basically 3 cell shapes and 2 arrangements, 2 or 3, call it 2.5 arrangements. The arrangements are that epithelial tissue can be simple or stratified. Simple means that all of the cells are in a single layer. So this is simple epithelia, one layer. Stratified epithelium has multiple layers of epithelial cells. So this is stratified epithelium. Here we have a layer here. Here's a second layer. Here's a third layer. Only the cells in the bottom layer actually touch the basement membrane. The cells in the farther up layers are attached by some sort of cell junction to the ones beneath them. There are also what are called pseudostratified. And here we have pseudostratified cells. Pseudostratified means that all of the cells attach to the basement membrane. So it is just one layer. Every cell touches the bottom. But because the cells aren't stacked up in neat rows, so like for instance here you can see all of the nuclei are at the same level, all of the cells at the same height. Here we see all of the nuclei are at the same level, all of the cells are the same height. Here you're going to have cells that are moving in different directions, like some of them are going to go behind other cells, some of them are going to have other cells in front of them so you can't see them very well. The nuclei will be at different levels. When you look at this under a microscope, it can look as if there are multiple layers of cells if you don't know what to look for. So it's called pseudostratified, meaning that it looks stratified, but it actually isn't. And these are only found with columnar cells. And columnar is one of the 3 cell shapes. The 3 cell shapes are squamous. Squamous cells, we talked about this a little bit ago, are basically look like fried eggs. They're flat with a little bit of a hump in the middle where the nucleus is. And they will be round or hexagonal or sometimes pentagonal, some sort of polygonal shape when viewed from the top. Cuboidal cells will be approximately as tall as they are wide. They usually have 4 sides when viewed under a microscope, but not always. It depends on which direction they've been sliced. But if you see epithelial cells densely packed, where each of the cells is about as tall as it is wide, you're looking at cuboidal epithelium. Columnar epithelial cells are cells whose height is significantly greater than their width. So they look like columns. Some will be taller than others. In simple columnar epithelium, usually all of the nuclei are at about the same height. But columnar cells can also be pseudostratified. Typically, squamous will be either simple or stratified. Cuboidal will be either simple or stratified. And columnar will be either simple or pseudostratified. There are very, very few points in the body, none that I can think of in the human body, although a few in other animals, where you will find true stratified columnar cells. Where do you find the different types of epithelial tissue in the body? There are a bunch of them. They're all in your textbook. Go read it. But I'm going to give you a overview right now. Okay? So, simple squamous. You will find simple squamous tissue most particularly in the lining of your lungs, especially the alveoli in your lungs, which are the exchange surface where you absorb oxygen and you excrete carbon dioxide. They're very, very thin layers that allow for this gas exchange, and that's why you have simple squamous tissue there. You'll often find simple squamous tissue in the endothelial, which is the inside epithelial lining of blood vessels as well. Simple cuboidal tissue. You will find simple cuboidal tissue in the kidneys, is a big area. You'll actually find simple cuboidal tissue in a bunch of different places in the body. You'll find it in the liver, quite a lot of it in the liver. You'll find a lot of it in other organs of the body, in a lot of different spongy type tissues, things like that. Stratified cuboidal. Now, with cuboidal tissue, there's actually 2 different motifs for stratified. They're not exactly different types. They're all stratified. But you will often find a double layer of cuboidal tissue, particularly in glands. And it's 2 layers, so it is stratified, but it's not like, 20 or 30 layers. There are places where you will find stratified cuboidal tissue, where you have like lots and lots and lots of layers of cuboidal cells, particularly in some parts of the skin, some parts of other lining in your mucous membranes and things like that. But a double layer is a pretty common arrangement that you see specifically with cuboidal tissue. Simple columnar. A good place to find simple columnar is anywhere in your digestive tract, past the stomach, into and past the stomach, so your lower digestive tract. All of this is lined with simple columnar cells, and these simple columnar cells are actually often absorptive. And when simple columnar cells are there for an absorption purpose, they will often have microvilli or a brush border on their top. You will also often find specialized cells called goblet cells embedded in them. These are mucus secreting cells because the lining where you find simple columnar is often in a mucous membrane, which we'll talk more about later on. But the mucous membrane needs to be able to secrete mucus. Well, most of these cells are absorbing nutrients and whatnot. The goblet cells are secreting mucus. Stratified squamous. A good place to find stratified squamous is in the skin, particularly the top layers or the top bits of your epidermis are stratified squamous. As you get further and further down your epidermis, the cells become more and more and more cuboidal until you get to the bottom layer of your epidermis, where the cells are basically cuboidal. And they turn into squamous cells the farther up they go. Pseudostratified columnar cells are pretty specifically found in the trachea. And they are also a part of a mucous membrane, so you see these embedded goblet cells, and those are secreting mucus. Now, in this, you can see if we magnify in on this, actually, let's go down here. This here is a brush border of microvilli. Remember, microvilli increase the surface area of absorption, and microvilli are often associated with simple columnar. In the body, pseudostratified columnar have something on them that looks often like a brush border, but it's actually cilia. And if you'll recall, cilia are these little hairs, but they can move. They aren't there to increase the surface area. They're actually there to push things past the cell. And so particularly you find these in the trachea because you exude this mucus from the surface, and that mucus is protective. It traps pathogens and dust particles. But you don't want that mucus draining down into your lungs. If enough of it drained down into your lungs, you'd eventually suffocate. So the purpose of the cilia is to push the mucus out in the same direction, right? And so it moves the mucus up your trachea into your mouth, where it will either drain into your stomach, down your esophagus, or you'll like hawk it up and spit it out or something like that. But it keeps the mucus from flowing down into your lungs, and that's important. Last is a special type that we didn't really talk about yet, called transitional epithelium. These are epithelial cells that can actually change shape. Usually they can change between being cuboidal and squamous. And you particularly find them in the bladder. The bladder has to be able to stretch. And most of the tissue in your body that stretches For instance, you have several different types of tissue in your body that can stretch. Most of them are connective tissue, right? Your blood vessels need to be able to stretch. Your heart needs to be able to stretch. You have, other things. Your nose and your ears need to be able to stretch. Your lungs need to be able to stretch. The stretchy portion is usually made out of one of various types of stretchy connective tissue, elastic tissue or elastic cartilage. However, connective tissue is not usually waterproof. And we talked about how your bladder needs to be waterproof. So it's got to be made out of this epithelium with tight junctions. But it also needs to be able to stretch. So what happens is that as your bladder fills up with urine and it stretches out, these cuboidal cells will sort of stretch out themselves and become squamous. And then as your bladder drains when you pee, they rebound and change shape to become cuboidal again. So they'll basically change from being cuboidal to being squamous or somewhere in between, depending upon how much urine there is filling up your bladder. And that's something that's pretty specific to the bladder and helps the bladder maintain its functionality. All right, bullet points for this lecture. You want to make sure that you know the three shapes of epithelial tissue: columnar, cuboidal, and squamous. You need to make sure that you know the arrangements of epithelial tissue: simple, stratified, pseudostratified. Know what transitional epithelium is, at least vaguely. And you should be able to know the main places in the body where different types of epithelial tissue will be found. You should know the functions of epithelial tissue and what it is. And you need to know the types of cell junctions, what function each type of cell junction performs, and what protein makes it up. You're going to find connexons in gap junctions and cadherins in desmosomes and integrins in hemidesmosomes. If you know all of those things, then you should be pretty good for this section.